welcome to episode 5 of Dress Histories with coffee length videos where you can put your feet up just for 10 minutes and listen to something hopefully interesting. Today I'm going to look at a different aspect of Queen Alexandra's wardrobe. You might recall from the previous 2 episodes that I have looked at aspects of her clothed body, her clothed royal body, that have included things like the auction, her dresses, studying surviving garments and the stories that they can tell. Today I'm looking at perhaps one of those elements of her style that mark her most important contribution to dress, and that's tailoring. Alexandra's tailoring was possibly the aesthetic for which she is best known. It's certainly what appears most often in photographs, surviving photographs of her. Surprisingly, there's very little that remains in terms of the garments themselves, and that's always been a great shame. The amazing tailor-made costumes that feature in lots of these images simply don't survive anymore. So we're going to look at a couple of things today, from her favourite tailors to images of the garments themselves and those few remaining items that still survive. It started with Alexandra with her riding habits. She married Edward, Prince of Wales, on March the 10th, 1863, and just 2 or 3 days after her marriage, she was ordering the first of her riding habits from the company of Henry Poole & Co. on Savile Row, which was the tailor most frequented at that point by Edward himself. Here she is in that riding habit, and the livery ledger actually describes it. It writes, "A fine black habit lined silk bound braid, £12, 12 shillings. A pair of elastic trousers, lined silk, 2 sets of collars and cuffs." That habit doesn't survive anymore, but you can see from the very outset of her marriage that here is Alexandra displaying what was to perhaps be her favourite way of dressing. From amongst all of the pomp and all of the formal events that she attended in all of her grandest garments, this much simpler way of dressing appears to have been that which suited her best. So there she is in her riding habit. In the week after their marriage, Edward and Alexandra went on their honeymoon to the Isle of Wight, and it is here that Alexandra forges a relationship with the maker that was to perhaps define her, certainly the first 2 decades of her royal career, and that is the firm of Redfern. Redfern was a draper on the Isle of Wight. John Redfern had actually been supplying the royal household for a number of years. So when Edward and Alexandra were on their honeymoon in the Isle of Wight, they placed an order which still survives in one of Queen Victoria's volumes of extraordinary bills, and it reads, "Making a muslin and silk linen toilette complete to pattern." It suggests that at this point Alexandra was giving John Redfern the pattern of garment that she wanted to have made up, and he was acting as the finisher, if you like, at the making a garment from pattern. But it was to go on to be much more than that. Here is a picture of some of the garments that Redfern became most famous for, some of the tailor-made costumes that suited his sporting style, the masculinized aesthetic of the yachting suit, of tennis outfits, close-fitting garments made in sombre shades. Redfern's star rose to great heights, largely thanks to the patronage of Alexandra. Moving from the Isle of Wight, he opened premises in London, in New York, in Paris, and diversified from selling simply tailor-made garments. He moved into much more elaborate garments as well. But it was the working relationship with Alexandra and these sharp garments, not suits, they weren't called suits at this point, that was still more closely allied to menswear. So when you see tailored garments from this era, they weren't described as suits in the context of women's wear, they were described as costumes. So it would be a tailor-made costume or a yachting costume, but not suits. Alexandra's patronage of Redfern did not last for the whole of her royal career, however. It seems to have been a feature of her choices with her wardrobe that as soon as a company became too well known, she tended to veer from supporting them in quite the same way, or certainly didn't purchase as much. She did carry on buying things from Redfern, and this appears throughout the wardrobe accounts until much later in her life. But the orders do dip, they aren't so numerous. And certainly by the 1890s, when Redfern was at the height of his professional popularity, Alexandra's patronage had slowed. And she had actually moved on to different suppliers. Now, Alexandra's clothed body, if you like, was a cause of some concern. The tailored garments really revealed an aspect of her physicality that wasn't particularly fashionable. Queen Victoria really felt quite anxious about Alexandra's slenderness. For example, she wrote in 1866 about Alexandra to her daughter. She is dear and good and gentle, but looking very thin and pale, but I think a little larger than last time. So the anxiety that Victoria felt about Alexandra's body was really accentuated through the wearing of such close-fitting garments as Alexandra wore. By the 1880s, Alexandra customarily took these garments, which had traditionally been worn in a sporting context, so for yachting, for riding, and she was wearing them every day. She was casting off the ribbons and the chiffon that might normally be associated with day wear, and she was wearing them as everyday garments. And this is what is perhaps the most significant contribution that she made. This meant that fabrics had to change as well. Here's Alexandra in a tweed garment, a tailor-made, in 1886, and she's with her son Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence. And you can see that this is a check wool dress. Companies had to change the design of their wool at this point because check fabrics had generally been worn by men, and they were in much larger repeats, much larger patterns. But as soon as women started to wear them for their tailor-made costumes, the size of repeats and the size of checks had to be reduced. The patterns had to be scaled down. So again, that's largely a contribution, important contribution that Alexandra certainly had influenced. By the 1890s, Alexandra had moved her interests to another couple of tailors. The first was Busfine. This is a waistcoat made by Busfine. It's made of hopsack. It's a particular kind of weave, and you can see it's quite a textured weave. This is a spotted hopsack, a red spot. The way that this has been mounted, this went on display at the Fashion Museum a couple of years ago for their Royal Women exhibition. You can see just how slender Alexandra was, even corseted. She has a very tiny waist. So this is a kind of beautifully tailored garment, a rare survival. Helpfully has her name inside. Here you can see the number, order number, and the fact that it belonged to Alexandra inked on the label inside the top of the waistcoat. So Busfine was a tailor that had begun to cater to these female consumers and enjoyed Alexandra's patronage for a number of years. The other tailor that she favoured at this point was the tailor Vernon. Vernon was a company that had started on Sloane Street, was as a fairly small concern, and then grown in stature as the years went by, and certainly as Alexandra's patronage was part of their marketing strategy, they acquired the royal warrant for the Queen, and so their premises, when you look at post office directories of the early 1900s, their premises expanded quite considerably at this time. There is a Vernon jacket that still survives. It's this from the Fashion Museum in Bath, and again you get a sense of this very pared back aesthetic that she so favoured. What's interesting about the surviving jackets is that they do exist in solitary, in isolation really. There aren't any of the actual costumes left. The skirts no longer survive. There are about 3 or 4 jackets of this type, yachting jackets, where they would have had a matching skirt, quite plain, gored, unembellished skirt, but they don't survive. And there's a reason for that turned up in the letters of relating to Mrs. Giltrap, Alexandra's dresser. And one of them explains, the skirts and other parts of the costumes were made into dresses by Mrs. Cook, who was Mrs. Giltrap's niece. So the quality of that serge, for example, was such that if the garments were given by Alexandra to another member of her household, somebody like Mrs. Giltrap, the jackets, I think, were often kept as souvenirs, whereas the skirts, which were much more ample, there was much more fabric, they could very usefully be turned into something that could be worn by somebody else. So there we have it. What I would argue is Alexandra's most significant contribution to women's wear in the late 19th and early 20th century, her sharply tailored garments that really paved the way for a working wardrobe that women were to follow for decades to come. So I hope you've enjoyed episode 5. See you again next time.